Relationships are never easy. But for Diane Beasley, romance seemed to be one hard knock after another.
I was brought up to think that you get married, you have kids, and you live happily ever after. And I went through a couple marriages trying to live happily ever after, and that never happened.
After 3 divorces, Diane wasn't expecting a fairy tale. So in the summer of 1998, when a coworker introduced her to the new guy in town, she kept an open mind, even though John Smith wasn't quite her cup of tea.
No, his looks weren't the deal for me, at all.
John had just moved from Ohio to California. The few people who knew him saw a warm, yet solitary guy.
I felt sorry for him because he seemed so lonely, and all he did was work 6, 7 days a week. He came across with a warm, good heart. That's what I liked about him.
John was dedicated to his job at a high-end car manufacturer. Diane loved fast cars and big engines. So when John asked her out to dinner, she agreed to go.
They had a great dinner, and next thing I knew, things were moving forward pretty fast.
Before long, Diane and John were sharing intimate details of their pasts.
A week and a half into it, I said, I'm divorced. I've been married a few times. And he says, I've been married twice, too.
John told Diane his first marriage ended in divorce. And sadly, his second ended in tragedy.
He says, my last wife died of cancer. And of course I said, oh, how sad.
He was having a very difficult time in life because of his wife.
But after just 6 weeks with Diane, John seemed ready to put his grief behind him, and he surprised her with a proposal.
And I kind of went, well, that's kind of soon.
Diane was very candid about saying I wasn't attracted to him, but he could help me. He could settle down my life. He could give me something I don't have right now, so why not?
That September, Diane married John Smith in front of an intimate group of friends and family.
Diane looked absolutely stunning, and a lot of smiles that day. You could tell that they were one happy couple.
I was going to do whatever I needed to do to make it last.
It was a fresh start for the couple. But when Diane moved in with John, she realized that he hadn't entirely left his past behind him.
When I moved in, he was already living there, and there was this huge picture of Fran on the wall. He said, do you want me to remove it? And I said, no, that's fine. I said, that's part of your past. And he said, thank you. And that was the end of it.
And for a while, that was the end of it.
This is a new beginning for me and John.
But Diane's newlywed bliss would come to a screeching halt only 8 months later. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was busy at her secretarial job when she had some surprise visitors.
Half an hour after I sat down, these guys came in suits, which is very odd for where I work. Usually everybody's in jeans. And I said, may I help you? And they said, are you Diane Smith? I said, yes.
The men were from the FBI, and they had a pointed question for Diane.
They asked me what John had told me about Fran, and I said he told me that his wife died of cancer.
And that's when the FBI dropped a bombshell. They told Diane that John's second wife, Fran, had not died of cancer. And his first marriage didn't end in a simple divorce.
I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
What really happened was far, far worse.
I could not believe it. I did not believe it.
How is he able to get away with so many horrible things for so many years?
In September of 1998, 8 months before a devastating visit from the FBI, Diane Beasley was enjoying her new marriage to John Smith.
We were doing a lot of sightseeing because he'd never been out here. I'm a native San Diegan.
They were always on the go. They loved to go to the beach and go for walks on the beach.
My life with John at that time was almost picture perfect.
But for Diane, there was one thing that could make the picture even prettier: a bigger home. Luckily, money was no object for John.
His family had real estate holdings, they had apartments. He'd never lacked for finances.
Before long, the couple found a place they liked and applied for a lease. But soon after submitting the application, Diane got a disturbing phone call from an apartment manager.
The apartment manager said, "You need to come here. I need to show you something." And I said, "What's the problem? Just tell me over the phone." And she said, "No, you need to see this." And I went, uh-oh.
Diane raced to the rental office, and when she arrived, the apartment manager had a copy of John's credit report. The results were jaw-dropping.
She showed me the credit report, which was 10 pages long of stuff that he hadn't paid. He had houses that he hadn't paid taxes on. They were in foreclosure. He had credit cards that he'd never paid. It was just terrible.
By the time John got home from work that evening, Diane was beside herself.
I said, "We can't even rent a place because of your credit."
But John had an explanation. He claimed the troubled properties really belonged to a relative.
He said, "I had to take him over, and I couldn't afford him."
John promised Diane he would fix everything.
He said that he can buy a house outright with cash. And he said, we'll just do that, you know, while I get this credit of mine straightened out. I thought, okay, all right, we'll just have to stay in this little granny flat here for a little bit longer, and then we can go and buy a house outright.
Over the next couple months, Diane focused on her new marriage. But she wasn't pleased when she noticed that John often seemed more interested in the computer than in her.
He was always at that computer. Why can't he be doing it at work, which he had access to a computer?
Even more worrisome was John's strange reaction when Diane interrupted his work.
Whenever I would go up there looking for him, all of a sudden the computer went off. And I thought, that's kind of odd, you know?
As the weeks went on, Diane couldn't help but notice how often John had to explain things away. Diane wondered if her new husband was hiding something, and she wasn't the only one. Her daughter Summer began to see a different side of John when she visited.
When I was home alone with him, he was very mad, angry. When he was out with my mom, he would talk really nice, be very sweet. And I used to tell my mom that. She kind of played it off, you know, I think you're just paranoid.
But by November of 1998, Diane was also baffled by John's furtive behavior. Too many details just didn't add up.
He didn't have a checking account. He had been out here for over a year and a half, and he was still resisting getting the California driver's license. And I thought that was very odd.
It seemed like John Smith was trying to fly under the radar.
He was a man who, as ordinary as he was, always seemed to have this strange, dark, secretive side.
And Diane would soon learn there was a terrifying reason why.
He knew that around each corner were FBI agents surveilling him.
Something was fishy about this man. I was afraid he was going to snap big.
By January of 1999, just 4 months into her marriage, Diane Beasley was certain that something was off with her new husband, John Smith.
He was very agitated, and I got to getting kind of concerned.
By now, his behavior had gone from merely strange to chilling.
We were coming back from dinner, and I was in front of him in one of the cars, and he was behind me. And I could see him in my rearview mirror, banging on the steering wheel, talking to himself, screaming and yelling at himself. And I thought, who's this guy? You know, I don't know this guy. He was just having a fit all by himself.
John is a man who walked around with secrets. He walked around with all this darkness that he hid. I think Diane saw a glimmer of light. Clearly, you can't ignore something like this.
But John's unnerving behavior was just a glimpse of what was to come. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was at work when 2 FBI agents paid her a visit. She was startled when they began to ask her questions about John's ex-wife, Fran, who Diane thought had died of cancer.
And then it all came out about John. They said, we're here for John Smith. We're investigating the murder of 2 of his wives. I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
The agents went on to explain that both of John's former wives had gone missing under suspicious circumstances.
The FBI was struck by the outrageous coincidences. This man was married twice, 2 missing wives. That just can't happen naturally.
By the time I got out of there, I was just dumbfounded. I was just shocked.
The story left Diane shaken, but she was determined not to believe a word of it until she heard John's side.
I couldn't believe this of John. John wasn't like this. They must have the wrong person.
And when John finally called her later that day, Diane was certain it was all a big mistake. Especially when she found out he had also been interrogated by the FBI and let go.
He was talking a mile a minute. He was very upset. He said the reason why he told me Fran died of cancer, he said because he didn't believe that Fran was missing. He think that she took off. He didn't want to shock me. He said that the first one, he told me the story about how he thinks a friend of hers killed her.
John claimed that he was being framed by the FBI for something he didn't do.
It was all conspiracy, and that's the reason why he left Ohio, because he couldn't get past any of this. It wasn't him.
At first, Diane believed her husband, but that was about to change. 2 weeks later, a special delivery letter addressed to Diane arrived in the mail.
Fran's sister wrote me a letter, and when I got it, it had a phone number on there for me to call her. And a couple days later, I did call her.
By the time Diane hung up the phone, her belief in her husband was shaken to the core.
The sister was telling me, we are convinced that John killed Fran. And she said, you're in danger of your life. Everything that the FBI told you is true.
Diane's focus immediately changed from being a supportive wife to just keeping herself alive.
I did what the FBI told me to do. When you start getting agitated when you're asking questions, quit right then. Don't irritate him.
Meanwhile, for investigators, the clock was ticking. With no bodies and only circumstantial evidence, detectives needed a smoking gun to prove John Smith was a murderer. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 15th, they got it.
The weak link for John Smith was somebody who was the closest to him, and that was his brother, Michael.
Michael Smith was John's younger brother. The FBI had questioned him extensively during the investigation, and they were certain Michael was hiding something.
He was tormented, and he had nightmares. And police could kind of sense this trouble beneath the surface with Michael, and they hammered him.
When Michael finally broke, he told detectives a horror story.
Michael told the police and the FBI about a wooden box he saw, a wooden box that his brother John had built and stored for years. And one day, Michael happened to open that box, and inside he saw the skeletal remains of John's former wife.
It was the break investigators had been waiting for. But there was one problem. Michael didn't know what had happened to the box.
It was brutal for Michael. He had nightmares about it. I think he was scared of John. He didn't want to end up in his own box.
For Diane, the news was horrifying. She just wanted to get out of her marriage alive. But leaving John Smith would not be easy. Diane was about to come face to face with the monster her husband truly was.
If Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By December of 1999, Diane Beasley had no doubt her husband, John Smith, was a murderer.
Real fear started to grip her. He's married 2 other women. One turned up dead in a box, the other one, we don't know where she is.
As soon as they found out what kind of person he is, they would leave him, and then they would be gone.
Determined not to be a third victim, Diane secretly went about getting her marriage annulled. On December 17th, John was served with papers. Anticipating the worst, Diane holed up in the apartment with her daughter, Summer. They changed the locks, hid the cars, and closed the blinds. And sure enough, John Smith arrived in a fury.
Summer was peeking out. She goes, "Here he comes."
He comes storming up, and it's like his face changed.
"Mom," she says, "he looks like a monster coming up here."
Diane immediately called 911.
We heard him pounding on the windows. You could hear his body being thrown up against the door. And then you could hear the door frame cracking.
He busted down the door. I didn't even recognize him. And as soon as he saw Summer, his whole demeanor had changed. "Baby, you don't need to do this. I don't want you to divorce me. I can explain everything." I knew right at that time, if Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
Diane survived the encounter, and John soon left the apartment. Meanwhile, armed with a shocking confession from John's brother Michael, detectives were on the hunt for the body of John's first wife, Janice Hartman.
In a desperate bid to try to find this body, the cops sent around a round of letters. And a policeman in Indiana was opening his mail one day and got this letter. Said, "Hey, did anybody find a body in a box?"
The grim question rang a bell.
One day in 1980, a road crew was working on this lonely pavement in the middle of an Indiana field when they came across a wooden box. They opened it up, and what was looking at them but the skeletal remains of a young woman.
The remains had never been identified, and the girl became known as the lady in the box. She was buried in a pauper's grave.
And this cop said, "I think we got your girl."
Investigators had the remains exhumed and tested, and when the results came back from the lab, the lady in the box was finally identified as Janice Hartman, John Smith's first wife. John's grisly secret had literally been unearthed.
I was devastated. I thought, this poor girl cut down by this monster, John.
On October 3rd, 2000, John Smith was arrested at work. At the trial 9 months later, Diane learned the extent of John's deceptions. All that time he'd spent on the computer wasn't just business, as he claimed. John was having multiple affairs.
So much of what police say John was motivated by was power, not money. It wasn't sex, it was power over these women. In the 2 cases in which his wives disappeared, the wives challenged him and crossed him. They took on his authority.
And that's when John Smith would snap.
John had lots of girlfriends, and so the fear is there are more than 2 missing Mrs. Smiths.
On July 19, 2001, John Smith was found guilty of murder in the case of Janice Hartman. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. Fran Gladden Smith, John's second wife, has never been found. It's been more than a decade since John Smith walked into her life, and Diane has closed the book on that unhappy chapter. But despite everything, Diane held fast to her belief in happily ever after. And 8 years ago, she found it in her new husband, Robert.
We have a new life together. We live here all by ourselves with visits from the kids and the grandchildren. So it couldn't be better. It's perfect.
Today, Diane surrounds herself with good friends and family, and she finally knows that happiness isn't just a fairy tale.
Yes, there is happily ever after, and I'm living proof of it.
As a Missouri farmer's daughter, Carolyn Cox always knew the value of hard work in life and in love.
I saw love and marriage as a commitment for life. It was a treasure that you protected at all costs.
The day she first spotted 17-year-old Billie Jo Cox working on her father's farm, Carolyn thought she had found that treasure.
I remember him walking up on the porch, and my mother answered the door, and he was so good looking. I think I fell in love with him immediately.
Before long, the two began to date. Raised in a strict religious home, Billie treated Carolyn well, taking her out on Saturday nights.
He was very shy, and when he did come to the school dances, he had never danced. He always had this very sweet smile with his lip curling up to the side, and everyone just really liked him a lot.
Soon, the couple was thinking about a future together.
He just seemed to be honest, gentle, loving, caring, and so what more could one ask?
3 years later, they made good on their promise and tied the knot in a traditional church ceremony. Carolyn was just 19.
We were married on Easter Sunday, and it was a blizzard. And I remember in the receiving line, this lady shook my hand and she says, "I hope your married life is not as snowy as your wedding day." And I've never forgotten it.
After the wedding, the young couple worked hard to get ahead. Billie joined the Air Force to earn money so they both could go to college. And soon they started a family.
We had our goals that I think were aligned together, so I thought we were a very good match.
2 children later, Carolyn graduated and worked to help support them while Billie finished his PhD in botany. But as Billie's graduation day grew closer, Carolyn began to notice a change in her husband's behavior.
Billie was seldom around. He was coming in late, a lot of nights drinking with friends. I don't know if he was feeling some pressures, but when Billie was under stress, he became very intolerant.
He would belittle her, so the particular argument that she had was ridiculous. Sometimes you could hear things getting thrown and that type of thing.
Billie's temper was troubling, and one night he suddenly became violent.
I don't know what the argument was, but he hit me. He socked me. And I had this black eye. And I was thinking, how can this be?
But Carolyn was determined to stick with her young marriage.
I made a decision that day that you're not giving up your marriage, you're not giving up your hopes and dreams. You just put it away, go on, this won't happen again.
Meanwhile, on the outside, life for the couple was looking up. Billie graduated with his PhD and found a good job at a chemical lab. But as the years went by, he had bigger ambitions.
He decided to take some things that he had developed and start his own business. So I was the breadwinner. I would teach all day and go work the business at nights and weekends.
With Carolyn's help, Billie built an agricultural chemical company from the ground up. And by the time the kids were grown and out of the house, business was booming. By the late 1990s, the Coxes were millionaires. The small-town sweethearts had come a long way.
They made a lovely, lovely couple. They had earned everything on their own, and I admired them for that.
We were considered like almost the perfect couple. We really were. We had succeeded, we had done well.
After nearly 4 decades together, the couple had finally achieved their dream. But Carolyn was about to wake to a terrible reality. On the night of September 12, 2004, Carolyn was packing their bags for a much-needed getaway to France with friends.
I never had been to Europe, so I was very happy.
But she and Billy would never get on that plane. The next morning, around 6 a.m., Carolyn woke to a sharp pain in her head.
The next thing I know is I'm on the rug, being pulled down the hall.
Barely conscious, Carolyn felt herself being moved into the garage. Her nightmare was just beginning. Carolyn was under attack, and the assault would cost her her husband and nearly her life.
He said, "You're worth more dead than alive."
And I'm like, what are you? You're not a human being.
In the spring of 1996, 8 years before the attack that would leave Carolyn Cox clinging to life, she and her husband Billy were hard at work growing their successful business.
It all gradually came together. We felt very good about what we had accomplished. We felt like we had reached those things that we had set out to reach.
But as the couple's net worth ballooned, so did their problems at home. Billy's temper had gone from bad to worse.
As he became more successful, I think he felt even more that he was above it all. Everything that he did, every shot he called, it was going to be his way or there was no way.
There was a very, very dark side that he didn't know when it could occur. So there was this fear at all times of when it possibly could come out. So you were careful.
More and more, Billy's anger would turn physical, often with no provocation.
We were sitting in the hot tub one night and we were talking, and I said something he didn't like, and with the back of the hand, he just suddenly hit me across the face. It was just so out of the blue.
Sometimes Billy's outbursts would leave their mark, but Carolyn took pains to hide the truth, even from her closest friends.
She would come to meetings sometimes in a neck brace or with her arm in a sling or a patch over her eye. Carolyn always had an excuse for these injuries. And to be quite honest, the general opinion was that Carolyn was a klutz.
At times, Carolyn thought about ending her marriage, but Billy's violent streaks didn't happen often.
These bad times might not show up for a year. And in between that, he could be very loving and he could be affectionate. When we would go for these spans and not having anything happen, I truly felt they would never happen again. And so when they showed up, I was always in shock.
But problems at home didn't slow down the family business. By 2002, the couple was worth $15 million and living in a 12,000 square foot mansion in Bull Valley, Illinois.
It was Carolyn's dream house. And they enjoyed entertaining for fundraisers and functions in Bull Valley.
We were living the dream. Being able to stand back and look at that and say, look what you have, how fortunate you are.
But it never seemed to be enough for Billy. He soon became obsessed with money, counting and recounting every penny they had.
He was constantly making records of his net worth, and he had some fixation on insurance. He was always buying insurance policies.
By the spring of 2004, Billy was acting even stranger.
If I touched him, his body was rigid. I would start to hug him, and it was almost like hugging a board. I just remember wondering, what is going on?
But one thing was better. Billy hadn't been violent towards Carolyn in over a year. Until one night, when he said something that gave her pause.
He bought an insurance policy on my life, and he was going over the information, and he said, "You're worth more dead than alive."
Carolyn knew that life insurance policy was worth more than $1 million, but they hardly needed the money, so she tried to laugh it off.
I refused to take it any other way. I turned to him and I said, "Well, I'm so glad that's not true."
Little did Carolyn realize just how deep Billy's anger was.
He looked at me with eyes that was just ice cold.
I thought, this looks like a photograph of a corpse.
In the summer of 2004, Billy and Carolyn Cox were the pillars of their Bull Valley community.
I was very involved in active in the community and very happy in what I was doing.
But behind closed doors, the Golden couple's marriage remained far from picture perfect.
We had gone to an event at friend's home, and when it was time for us to leave, one of my friends said, "It is so nice to see a couple who've been together so many years who still love each other." And he turned with the most hatred and the worst anger and said to me, "That may change at any moment."
Billy's anger seemed to be building, and Carolyn had no idea why. So when good friends Beth and Jim Wester proposed a vacation in France, Carolyn was eager for a change of scenery.
Billy's initial reaction to it was that we shouldn't go, and I said, if we don't take advantage of this, I'm afraid we'll never do it. Then he seemed to be going along with it.
But Billy and Carolyn would never board that plane. On the morning of September 13th, 2004, Carolyn awoke to a crushing pain in her head. Dazed, she had no idea what was happening.
My first sense of something was my husband lifting me off the bed, and I reached for him. And the next thing I know is I'm on the rug being pulled by him down the hall, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You fell out of bed and hit your head. I'm taking you to the doctor."
Billy dragged Carolyn down to the garage.
He placed me right on the cold concrete floor out there. And I kept saying, "Where's the ambulance? Where's the ambulance?" And he said, "They're on other jobs."
Bleeding heavily, Carolyn slipped in and out of consciousness, praying that Billy would be able to help her. But her prayers were in vain.
As I'm lying there with my eyes shut, all of a sudden, something hit me across the left side of my face. I said, "I think I'm dying." And he just stood there. He didn't do anything. He didn't say anything.
Instead, Billy picked her up, dumped her into the back of his SUV, started it, and walked away.
I'm in the car, and I'm realizing it's getting really hot. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. And I kept telling myself, "You'll die. You can't go to sleep. You have to do something."
With her last ounce of strength, Carolyn managed to crawl to the garage door, only to find that it was locked. Then she knew her husband of 43 years wasn't going to help her. He was trying to kill her.
I did not understand till those doors were locked what he was really doing.
Meanwhile, the Westers had been trying to reach them. They were scheduled to leave for the airport.
I called him at 8:30 in the morning, but nobody answered. And I said, "Well, that's odd."
But as the morning wore on and still no word from the Coxes, Jim began to worry.
Around 10:30, I realized this is not right. This is not normal. Nobody would answer any of the phones. And then I kept thinking, their house is way off the road. What if something happened?
I get a phone call from Beth Wester, and she says, "Do you think maybe that we should call the police?"
Around 12:30 p.m., local police arrived at the house. He climbed through an open window and made a gruesome discovery.
He literally encountered a bloodbath in the foyer. He entered into the garage. The garage was full of carbon monoxide, and it was very hot in there. He observed Carolyn laying across the front seat of Billy Cox's truck, bleeding heavily from her face, and she said to him, "Help me," and then she lost consciousness.
As paramedics worked to save Carolyn, Billy mysteriously appeared, claiming he'd been outside on the grounds all morning.
He was standing there very calmly and said, "Did she fall?" At that point, the chief was very suspicious of what had occurred.
Carolyn was rushed to the hospital, and police began to question Billy. But soon he complained of chest pains and was taken to the same hospital as his dying wife.
They took me back to the room where my mother was, and I looked at her and I didn't even recognize her. And she said, "Why did he do this to me?" They said that my father had been brought in, and do you want to see him? When I got in there, there's the face of complete bull. Never asked about my mother until the very end.
Doctors could find nothing wrong with Billy, so he did what any man would do when his wife's life was hanging by a thread. He went out to dinner.
The chief was immediately suspicious of Billy because of the crime scene. Someone was cleaning up that foyer. There were rugs that had been rolled up that were full of her blood. There was also no explanation as to why the garage doors were all disabled, vehicles were running, and the door entering into the home was locked.
The evidence appeared to point in one direction. As soon as Billy finished his pork chops, police brought him in and arrested him.
Why would you take it to that level? Could have divorced her. Not only was he trying to kill her, he was trying to make her suffer.
2 days later, Carolyn awoke from surgery to hearing loss, metal plates in her face, and damaged vision. She was in shock that the man she had devoted her entire life to had just tried to kill her.
The coming to and knowing, oh, the heartbreak, it's just the devastation. I couldn't believe it. I lost my husband. I nearly lost my life, and I lost my husband.
But beyond heartbroken, Carolyn was also afraid. Billy had posted bail, and his reign of terror was far from over.
I believe that he wanted Carolyn dead.
I was just terrified all the time.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In September 2004, the exclusive town of Bull Valley, Illinois, was shaken to its core. Billy Cox, one of its most prominent residents, had brutally attacked his wife, Carolyn.
The story was front page, and the people in the area were just in shock.
Even Carolyn's closest friends didn't see it coming.
It kind of blew me away. I mean, you just look at this whole thing and you realize I didn't know the guy at all. I was seeing what he wanted me to see.
4 days after the attack, Carolyn filed for divorce from her hospital bed. The golden couple's marriage was over.
You saw her heart was broken, and that was very hard.
When she was finally released, Carolyn insisted on returning home. Billy was out on bail, and despite a restraining order, she was still afraid of him.
He was seen at the end of my drive. He was seen going up and down the street. And I was just terrified all the time.
There were many phone calls I had with her where she was sobbing, and I kept telling her to just have faith that eventually we would get to trial and justice would prevail.
In March 2007, 2.5 years after the attack, Billy finally had his day in court.
Billy's defense was that Carolyn decided to walk into the garage and climb up a ladder, and she fell backwards, and a board struck her on the front of her face. I had no doubt that Billy Cox was trying to kill Carolyn on that day. He tortured his wife for more than 6 hours that morning.
On the stand, Billy denied everything.
He has a very sinister side to him. He showed no empathy at all for Carolyn.
The jury sided with Carolyn. On April 11, 2007, Billy Joe Cox was convicted of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. To date, he has never admitted what he did to his wife that day, or why.
I don't believe the initial attack was premeditated. Billy Cox had abused her throughout their 40-year marriage repeatedly. He hit her hard enough this time, though, that no one was going to believe that she fell. So he realized that he had to end her life in order to protect himself.
Even behind bars, Billy's rage continued to burn. In 2009, he was investigated for allegedly trying to put a hit out on Carolyn.
I was informed that he had been approaching another inmate, asking him to kill Carolyn.
I know he has friends within the prison, so there is definitely fear that he can hurt me.
7 painful surgeries later, Carolyn's face has been repaired, and she's finally mending her heart.
A year and a half after this happened to me, I met Dennis, who is my husband. He's a caregiver, a very loving man, and I'm very happy.
It's wonderful to see my mom happily married. She absolutely deserves it. It's about time.
Today, Carolyn devotes her time to speaking on behalf of victims of domestic violence.
There's this myth that happens to less educated people or poor people, but there are many people that are in a domestic violence situation that are just like me.
Now, Carolyn knows that some marriages shouldn't last forever, but the sadness still lingers.
It's tough to cope with the heartbreak. It's always going to be there. It gets better, but it'll always be there.
The last person who saw her alive never spoke again. 19 years. 19 years of silence, stretching across a Texas highway that cuts through dust, heat, and memory, where the wind still drags questions across the asphalt like scraps of old police tape. It was August 2005, and the heat arrived before the sun. In this part of Texas, morning does not wake gently. It presses down, heavy and unforgiving, turning quiet streets into something watchful. The kind of quiet where a single car door closing can echo for minutes, where neighbors remember sounds long after they forget faces. That was the morning she disappeared. No scream, no struggle witnessed, just absence. Sudden, total. Her name appeared first on a corkboard at the county sheriff's office, printed in black ink, pinned crookedly beside a faded map. 24 years old, local, known, someone people recognized at the gas station, at church, in the grocery store aisle, where conversations paused just long enough to feel polite. She had plans that week, a shift to cover, a phone call she promised to return. None of it happened. By noon, her car was found on the shoulder of a rural access road. Engine cold, door unlocked, purse inside, phone gone. The scene felt wrong in the way investigators learned to recognize immediately. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just a quiet refusal to make sense. No skid marks, no signs of a breakdown, no explanation for why she would stop there, in that stretch of land where nothing ever happens and no one ever lingers. The first patrol unit called it in as a welfare check. By the time detectives arrived, the word missing had already hardened into something heavier. The air carried that familiar tension, the one that settles when everyone knows the clock is already working against them. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers lined up along the tree line. Flashlights cut through tall grass as the sun dropped and shadows lengthened into something that felt permanent. They found nothing. No footprints that led anywhere. No fabric caught on branches. No witnesses who could agree on a time or a direction. Just a vehicle, a stretch of road, and the creeping realization that someone had vanished in plain sight. The community reacted fast, and then all at once, flyers on telephone poles, candlelight vigils where people whispered theories they would later deny ever saying out loud. Local news ran the same photo every night. Her smiling, cropped just tight enough to feel intimate, as if the camera had caught her mid-laugh. Missing woman, the anchor said. Police ask for information. Information came in waves. Sightings, tips, rumors. A woman who looked like her at a truck stop 2 counties away. A scream someone thought they heard after midnight. A strange pickup parked near the road earlier that morning. Every lead was chased. Every lead collapsed. Days turned into weeks, and the case began to thin, stretched too far across too many possibilities. Detectives started mapping her last known hours. The timeline was tight, frustratingly so. She left her apartment just after sunrise. A neighbor remembered the sound of her car. Another recalled seeing her at a red light near the highway. After that, the trail broke cleanly, like it had been cut on purpose. Her phone record showed a final call, less than a minute long. The number belonged to someone she knew, someone who lived nearby, someone who answered questions carefully, politely, and then stopped answering altogether. He said they talked about nothing important. He said he hadn't seen her that day. He said he wished he could help. And then he lawyered up. In Texas, that choice doesn't prove guilt. But in a small town, it changes the temperature. Conversations shifted. Names were spoken more quietly. People began to remember things differently. An argument overheard months earlier. A look that lingered too long. A relationship that felt complicated in hindsight. Investigators took note. But suspicion alone doesn't close a case. Search efforts expanded. Fields, drainage ditches, abandoned properties. The heat turned brutal, baking the land and erasing whatever traces might have been left behind. By the time autumn arrived, hope had thinned into something fragile and private, carried mostly by her family and a handful of detectives who refused to let the files slide to the back of the cabinet. Then the calls slowed. Then they stopped. The case was officially reclassified. Cold case. 2 words that sound clinical, almost neat, but carry a weight that never settles. Evidence boxed. Leads archived. The community moved forward the way communities always do. Not because answers are found, but because life demands motion even when justice does not. Years passed. New faces replaced old ones at the sheriff's office. Technology changed. DNA databases grew. Files were digitized, rescanned, relabeled. Her photo remained the same, frozen in 2005, while everything else aged around it. And somewhere in Texas, someone kept quiet. 19 years later, that silence would finally break, at least on paper. An arrest. A headline. Texas 2005 cold case cracked. Suspect caught after 19 years of silence. The words spread fast, carrying relief, shock, and an uneasy question that no one wanted to say out loud yet, because solving a case and understanding it are not the same thing. And as investigators would soon realize, some silences don't end when someone starts talking. They only change shape. The arrest came without warning, announced in a press conference that felt rehearsed but strained, as if even the microphones understood the weight of what was being said. 19 years after the disappearance, a man was let out of his home in handcuffs, cameras flashing against a face that had aged quietly, normally, like anyone else who believed time would keep its promises. Neighbors stood barefoot on lawns, squinting into the glare, whispering the same sentence again and again. I never thought it would be him. A phrase that means everything and nothing all at once. His name had never left the file. It had simply settled into it, layered under reports, tips, and margins filled with question marks. Back in 2005, detectives had circled him early, not because of evidence that screamed guilt, but because of proximity, because of that final call, because of a familiarity that felt too close to be ignored. He was cooperative at first, present, careful with words, always just helpful enough to stay in the room without stepping into the spotlight. Then he vanished from the conversation, not physically, but legally, retreating behind counsel and routine, building a life that looked unremarkable from the outside. What reopened the case wasn't a confession or a witness breaking down under pressure. It was paperwork, old evidence retested, new algorithms running across databases that didn't exist when the case went cold. A sample that once said nothing now spoke just loudly enough to be heard. Partial, inconclusive to some, enough for others. The kind of result that doesn't end debates, it starts them. Investigators reconstructed the day again, this time with a different lens, peeling back assumptions they had learned to live with. The access road where her car was found was no longer just a location. It became a decision point. Someone had guided her there, or followed her there, or waited for her there. The timeline tightened further, squeezing out coincidences until only intent remained. They looked at phone records like they were reading a confession, written in code. Calls that lasted seconds, gaps that stretched just a little too long, towers that placed people closer together than they had ever admitted. Patterns emerged, subtle but persistent, forming a shape that felt familiar to detectives who had seen it before. Not proof, but direction. The suspect denied everything. He always had. When confronted again, nearly 2 decades later, his answers sounded practiced, as if they had been waiting, stored somewhere behind his eyes. He said he barely remembered that day. He said time changes memories. He said people wanted closure more than truth. It was a careful defense, one that acknowledged emotion without yielding ground. Meanwhile, the town fractured along invisible lines. Some wanted the case closed, the narrative sealed at last, regardless of how rough the edges were. Others felt something slipping through their fingers, an intuition that didn't sit right. They remembered how fast the case cooled, how easily the questions had been shelved. They remembered that her body had never been found. Because an arrest is not an ending, it's a punctuation mark. Prosecutors spoke of confidence, of science, of patience finally paying off. Defense attorneys spoke of gaps, of contamination, of the danger of letting time stand in for certainty. The words bounced back and forth in the media, each side sharpening its language, while the truth, whatever shape it had taken, remained stubbornly out of reach. Her family watched it all unfold with a restraint that looked like strength from a distance, and exhaustion up close. They had lived with the not knowing for so long that resolution felt foreign, almost intrusive. They answered questions carefully, refusing to celebrate, refusing to condemn, holding themselves in a narrow space between hope and dread. Investigators revisited witnesses who had grown older, some forgetful, some suddenly eager to talk. Memories shifted, details changed. A truck that had once been red was now dark. A time once remembered as early morning drifted closer to noon. Each revision complicated the picture, not clarifying it. They returned to the land, the same fields, the same ditches, areas that had been searched before, now altered by years of weather and development. New construction sat on old ground. Parking lots poured over dirt that had once been soft enough to hold secrets. Ground-penetrating radar hummed, machines tracing invisible lines beneath the surface, listening for disturbances that might resemble answers. Nothing surfaced. The absence began to speak louder than any evidence. No remains, no weapon, no definitive scene of violence. Just a theory built on fragments, on probabilities sharpened by time and technology. To some, it was enough. To others, it felt like a story trying too hard to end. In private moments, detectives admitted what they never said on camera. That cold cases don't reopen because of certainty. They reopen because of discomfort, because something never settled the way it should have, because a name keeps resurfacing when everything else fades. And yet, even as the case moved forward, new questions slipped in through the cracks. Why here? Why that road? Why leave the car intact? Why take the phone and nothing else? These were not details that fit neatly into the prosecution's timeline. They lingered, unanswered, like a low-frequency hum beneath the official narrative. The suspect sat in jail awaiting trial, his silence intact, his past now under a microscope. Old acquaintances were interviewed, relationships dissected, every disagreement reinterpreted as potential motive. It was a familiar ritual, one the town had seen before in other cases, other years, always accompanied by the same uneasy thought that once a story gains momentum, it can carry people with it, whether they belong there or not. As the anniversary of her disappearance approached again, the candles returned. The vigils felt different this time, heavier, conflicted. Some people spoke of justice finally arriving. Others spoke of waiting, of the need to listen more closely to what had not been found, not been said, not been proven, because somewhere between the arrest and the truth, there was still a gap. And gaps have a way of swallowing certainty whole. As the case pushed forward, the past began to surface in ways no one could fully control. Old interviews were replayed, their static-filled recordings now stripped down and analyzed, every pause magnified, every hesitation treated like a potential fault line. In 2005, those pauses had sounded ordinary, In 2024, they felt loaded, as if silence itself had learned to speak. Detectives returned to the earliest hours of investigation, when adrenaline still outweighed caution. Back then, decisions were made quickly. Roads blocked, tips prioritized, names highlighted in red. Some of those choices now looked impulsive. Others looked prophetic. The suspect's interview stood out not because of what he said, but because of what he never did. He never asked what investigators thought had happened, never speculated, never expressed fear. His concern was narrow, precise, almost procedural. Psychologists would later describe it as emotional economy, the habit of revealing only what is necessary, conserving everything else. In court filings, prosecutors framed it as detachment. The defense called it shock. Both interpretations existed comfortably side by side, and neither could be proven. The narrative hardened in public. Headlines repeated the phrase "cold case" cracked until it felt permanent, irreversible. But inside the investigation, the ground remained unstable. One detective, now retired, admitted that the case file still didn't read like a solved crime. It read like a compromise, an answer built because time demanded one. They examined the suspect's movements again, overlaying maps from different years, aligning old cell data with modern satellite imagery. Places that once felt distant now overlapped in unsettling ways. Shortcuts appeared, blind spots revealed themselves. Routes emerged that no one had considered because no one had needed to. And still there was the phone, taken from the car, never recovered. Its absence felt deliberate, too intentional to dismiss. In 2005, it was explained away as opportunistic. Someone panicked, someone grabbed it. Now it felt more precise, like the removal of a witness. The phone held timestamps, location data, conversations frozen in circuits. Its disappearance left a hole that technology could not fill retroactively. Witnesses resurfaced, drawn by news coverage and the gravitational pull of a case suddenly back in motion. Some brought stories they had shared before. Others arrived with revisions, details that had grown sharper over time, not duller. One man recalled a vehicle parked near the access road, engine running, windows tinted. He had dismissed it then. He regretted that now. Another witness recounted seeing her days before she vanished, describing tension in her voice, a distraction she couldn't explain. Investigators asked the same question they had asked 19 years earlier. Did she say why? The answer was still no. The defense began constructing its counter-narrative carefully, methodically. They spoke of confirmation bias, of investigators returning to familiar names, because unfamiliar ones were harder to chase. They reminded the court that memory degrades, that science evolves, that evidence can be reinterpreted until it resembles intent. They emphasized what was missing, not what had been found. And what was missing was substantial. No blood, no body, no confession, no definitive crime scene. Just a theory that leaned heavily on proximity and probability. The kind of theory that feels persuasive until it's tested, until someone asks it to stand without emotional support. Behind closed doors, some investigators wrestled with doubts they would never voice publicly. They had waited years for movement, for validation that their instincts in 2005 hadn't been wrong. Now that movement had come, and it didn't feel the way they had imagined. It felt quieter, fragile, like something that could still slip away. The town listened closely as pretrial motions filled local news cycles. People argued in diners and parking lots, parsing legal language they had never cared about before. DNA doesn't lie, some said. DNA isn't everything, others replied. The conversations grew sharper, less patient, as if uncertainty itself had become an irritant. Her name remained at the center of it all, invoked constantly, sometimes reverently, sometimes strategically. Advocates spoke of her life, her ambitions, the injustice of waiting nearly 2 decades for accountability. Critics warned against letting grief steer verdicts. Both sides claimed to be protecting her memory. Late one evening, a journalist uncovered something buried deep in the early reports, a tip that had been logged and dismissed within days of her disappearance. It mentioned another person, another vehicle, another possible destination. The lead had gone nowhere at the time, overshadowed by stronger suspicions. Now it resurfaced, awkward and inconvenient, refusing to stay buried. Investigators acknowledged it reluctantly, re-interviewing the source, retracing steps that no longer existed. The area had changed. The people involved had moved on or passed away. The trail dissolved almost immediately, but its brief reappearance was enough to reignite doubt. Because cold cases don't just haunt families, they haunt systems. They linger in the spaces where certainty was assumed but never earned. As trial preparations intensified, pressure mounted on the suspect to speak, to clarify, to explain the years of silence. He did not. His attorneys advised restraint. Silence had protected him before. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't continue to do so. In that silence, speculation thrived. Some believed he was waiting, confident the case would collapse under its own weight. Others believed he was afraid, trapped by a truth that could no longer stay hidden. Both interpretations fed the same hunger, for an ending that felt deserved. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that this case was no longer just about what happened in 2005. It was about what had happened since, the assumptions made, the paths abandoned, the narrative that had slowly replaced the mystery itself. And as the courtroom lights flickered on and the first motions were scheduled, one uncomfortable reality pressed in from all sides. Even if a verdict came, even if a sentence was handed down, there were questions this case might never answer. Because some mysteries don't resist resolution out of defiance. They resist because the truth was fractured from the start. The closer the case moved toward trial, the more the past seemed to resist being organized. Evidence refused to line up neatly. Timelines overlapped where they shouldn't. Certainties softened under scrutiny. What once felt like a straight line now looked like a spiral, circling the same unanswered moments again and again. Prosecutors refined their theory until it sounded inevitable. They spoke of opportunity, narrowing into action, of a relationship that created access, of a moment where choice eclipsed restraint. In their telling, the access road was not random. It was familiar, known, a place chosen because it reduced witnesses, because it simplified control. The absence of chaos at the scene was framed as evidence of planning, not mercy. But planning implies motive, and motive proved elusive. Financial stress was suggested, then weakened. Emotional conflict was implied, then blurred by contradictory accounts. There was no documented threat, no explosive argument, no history that clearly escalated toward violence. What existed instead was ambiguity, the kind that can be interpreted in multiple directions, depending on where one stands. Defense investigators pushed hard into that space. They pulled apart the state's timeline minute by minute, highlighting assumptions disguised as facts. They questioned why certain routes were emphasized while others were ignored, why some witnesses were elevated while others faded. They reminded the court that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, unless it's being used selectively. Outside the courtroom, the community's patience wore thin. 19 years had trained people to live with uncertainty, but the promise of resolution brought its own kind of tension. Now that an answer had been offered, rejecting it felt almost disloyal. Accepting it, however, required overlooking details that didn't fit. Journalists revisited the early days of coverage, uncovering how language had shaped perception. Words like suspect had quietly transformed into person of interest, then slipped back again when the story needed momentum. Each shift left residue, guiding public opinion subtly, persistently. One detail, overlooked for years, began to draw renewed attention: the condition of the car. Clean, unrushed, keys still inside, no signs of forced entry. Investigators had long argued this meant she knew the person she encountered. But critics pointed out another possibility: that she was interrupted, redirected, convinced rather than coerced. That possibility widened the circle again, threatening to undo the narrowing that had made the arrest possible. The landscape itself became part of the argument. Texas is vast, but this stretch of land was intimate, shaped by habit. Locals knew which roads were empty at which hours, which turns disappeared from view. The access road was not hidden. It was overlooked, passed daily by drivers who never stopped. That visibility complicated assumptions about secrecy and risk. Experts testified about memory under stress, about how recall shifts when trauma lingers without resolution. Witness statements from 2005 were compared against later interviews. Discrepancies cataloged like fractures in glass. Some differences were minor, others were not. The defense seized on each one, while prosecutors argued consistency of essence, if not detail. Her family remained mostly silent, seated behind rows of legal teams who spoke on their behalf without truly speaking for them. Their faces were read constantly, by cameras, by commentators, by strangers searching for cues. Grief was interpreted as evidence, restraint mistaken for resolve. They became part of the story without ever being asked if they wanted to be. Behind the scenes, investigators confronted an uncomfortable truth. Reopening a cold case doesn't just revive facts, it revives mistakes. Early leads that were deprioritized now look significant. Decisions made under pressure appeared careless in retrospect. No one wanted to admit how close the case had come to being forgotten entirely. A former deputy, interviewed anonymously, acknowledged that the department in 2005 had been overwhelmed, understaffed, stretched thin by other crises. Resources were limited. Choices were made quickly, sometimes permanently. That admission cast a shadow over the current certainty, raising questions about whether today's confidence was built on yesterday's gaps. The suspect's silence continued, unbroken. Not a plea, not a statement, just procedural compliance and careful distance. Some saw arrogance, others saw fear. Silence, like absence, invited projection. As jury selection approached, legal analysts debated whether the case was too old to try, too compromised by time. They spoke of faded memories and lost evidence, of the risk of turning speculation into verdict. Yet they also acknowledged the pressure to act, to demonstrate that no crime truly expires, that patience and persistence eventually prevail. The contradiction sat at the heart of the case. Justice delayed can still be justice, but it can also be distortion. On the eve of the trial, a storm rolled through the region. Heavy rain pounding streets that had been dry for weeks. Water pooled along the access road, filling shallow depressions that had once been searched by hand and eye. The land looked different underwater, softer, almost mutable, as if it were trying to rearrange itself. It was a reminder that environments change, memories shift, and stories evolve whether the truth keeps up or not. When the courtroom doors finally opened, what entered was not just a case file or a defendant. It was 19 years of waiting, layered with expectation, fear, and the quiet dread that even now, with everything laid bare, something essential was still missing. The trial began without ceremony, the way long-awaited moments often do. No dramatic entrance, no audible gasp, just the slow settling of bodies into seats and the subtle click of pens preparing to take notes that might never capture what was truly at stake. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have, compressed by the weight of years that had nowhere else to go. Opening statements framed two incompatible realities. The prosecution spoke in clean lines, confident arcs, presenting a story that moved forward without hesitation. They described a moment in 2005 when familiarity turned dangerous, when a routine morning fractured into something irreversible. Their language was precise, almost economical, designed to leave no space for alternative explanations. The defense responded by widening that space deliberately. They reminded the jury that stories can feel complete without being true, that repetition does not equal proof, that the distance between suspicion and certainty is where justice either holds or collapses. They emphasized what the state could not show, what time had taken with it, what assumptions had filled in place of evidence. Witnesses followed, one after another, carrying fragments of memory like objects wrapped in tissue. A neighbor described the sound of a car that morning, the way it faded sooner than expected. A coworker recalled a missed shift, a call that went unanswered. Their testimonies overlapped just enough to suggest cohesion, but not enough to lock together. Experts took the stand next. Analysts spoke of cell tower pings, of probability fields, of margins of error that sounded abstract until they were attached to a human life. Maps were projected, lines drawn and redrawn. The suspect's movements were placed within those margins, close enough to be concerning, far enough to be contested. The DNA evidence was presented carefully, almost cautiously. The prosecution described it as a breakthrough, a technological correction to a past limitation. The defense called it fragile, pointing out chain of custody issues, degradation, the danger of overinterpreting partial matches. Jurors listened intently, faces still, absorbing information that came wrapped in authority but laced with doubt. The absence of a body loomed over every exchange. It was never named directly, but it shaped the air, an invisible presence that both sides circled without touching. Prosecutors suggested that violence can erase its own traces. Defense attorneys reminded the court that erasure can also be imagined. Midway through the proceedings, a witness faltered. Under cross-examination, a timeline shifted. Minutes moved. A memory adjusted itself under pressure, bending just enough to draw attention. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a crack, and everyone in the room felt it. The judge called for a brief recess. In the hallway, conversations hummed low and urgent. Reporters updated feeds, choosing words that balanced caution with drama. Outside, rain clouds gathered again, the sky mirroring the tension inside. When court resumed, the prosecution leaned harder on pattern. They spoke of behavior before and after the disappearance, of changes that suggested knowledge rather than coincidence. The defense countered with context, arguing that grief, fear, and scrutiny alter people in unpredictable ways. Both narratives relied on interpretation more than fact, and both knew it. The suspect watched quietly from the defense table, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the gallery. His stillness became its own point of contention, dissected by commentators who saw either guilt or discipline in the same posture. Her family remained present but distant, eyes forward, absorbing each detail with a restraint that suggested practice. They had endured speculation for years. Now it was formalized, sanctioned, delivered under oath. Each word carried consequence, whether it clarified or confused. As the days wore on, fatigue set in. Jurors shifted in their seats. Attorneys repeated arguments with slight variations, hoping resonance would do what evidence could not. The case began to feel less like a search for truth and more like a test of endurance. Closing arguments approached with a sense of inevitability that felt premature. The prosecution asked the jury to trust the convergence of facts, to see the pattern as intention. The defense asked them to resist that pull, to remember that uncertainty is not a failure of justice, but its safeguard. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, almost accusatory. Outside, the town waited again, suspended between belief and doubt, aware that whatever came next would not erase the past. It would simply choose how to live with it. Deliberations unfolded behind closed doors, but their presence leaked into the hallways like a low-pressure system. Hours stretched, then days. Each tick of the clock felt amplified, a reminder that consensus is slow when certainty is thin. Jurors asked for transcripts, requested exhibits, returned to the same pieces again and again, as if repetition might sharpen them into something decisive. Inside that room, the case fractured along familiar lines. Some jurors leaned toward the narrative that had been offered so confidently, persuaded by accumulation, by the sense that too many small things pointed in the same direction to be coincidence. Others resisted, anchored to the gaps, to the quiet insistence that probability is not proof. Voices rose, then softened, then rose again. Outside, speculation filled the void. Commentators dissected jury questions like tea leaves, reading intention into every request. The phrase cold case cracked began to feel premature, almost reckless, as if language itself had run ahead of the facts. When the jury returned, the room stood. The verdict was read with careful neutrality, each word measured, deliberate. Not guilty. The phrase landed without drama, but its impact was immediate, rippling outward through the gallery, through the town, through 19 years of expectation. There was no outburst, no visible collapse, just a quiet recalibration of faces, of breaths. The suspect closed his eyes briefly, not in relief so much as release, as if he had been holding himself in place for decades. His attorneys nodded, already shifting toward procedure, toward the mechanics of freedom. The prosecution absorbed the moment with professional restraint. They had lost the case, but not the conviction that their theory was sound. In statements afterward, they spoke of respect for the process, of evidence presented in good faith. They avoided the word failure, choosing instead to emphasize effort. For her family, the verdict did not feel like an ending. It felt like a return, back to the same unanswered morning, the same empty road, the same absence that had defined their lives for nearly 2 decades. Closure, once again, remained theoretical. The media pivoted quickly, reframing the story in real time. Acquittal shocks community. Cold case verdict leaves questions. The headlines softened the certainty they had once amplified, adapting to a reality that refused to cooperate with resolution. In the days that followed, debates intensified. Some argued that justice had been served, that the system had done what it was designed to do, resist conviction without proof beyond doubt. Others believed the verdict represented a failure of will, a reluctance to hold someone accountable simply because time had eroded clarity. Investigators returned to their offices with boxes reopened and nowhere to put them. The acquittal did not close the case in spirit, but it complicated it beyond recognition. The suspect could not be tried again. The narrative that had driven the reopening now existed without a legal endpoint. Privately, detectives revisited their own conclusions. Had they pushed too hard on one path? Had the promise of resolution narrowed their vision? These questions stayed internal, unrecorded, but they lingered, reshaping how the case would be remembered within the department. Public interest began to fade, as it always does, drawn toward newer stories with cleaner edges. But the case itself did not disappear. It settled back into its familiar position, unsolved, unresolved, resistant to classification. Years of silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Heavier, complicated by what had almost been an answer. The acquittal did not restore the missing. It did not explain the phone, the road, the morning heat. It simply removed one possibility from the board, leaving the rest untouched. The access road remained open, traffic passing without pause. Drivers slowed sometimes, glancing toward the shoulder where her car had once been found, then moved on. The land held its shape, indifferent to verdicts, unchanged by human attempts at narrative. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, a realization settled in, unwelcome but unavoidable. The trial had not solved the case. It had only proven how much of it was still missing. After the verdict, the case entered a strange afterlife. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everything had. Files were returned to shelves with a different weight, their labels unchanged but their meaning altered. What had once been an open question was now a contested memory, shaped by testimony, arguments, and a decision that could not be undone. Law enforcement issued brief statements about keeping the investigation active, about following any credible new leads. The words sounded familiar, almost ceremonial. Everyone knew what they meant in practice. The case would remain alive on paper, breathing slowly, waiting for something unlikely to disturb its rest. The suspect resumed his life under a new kind of scrutiny. Acquittal did not erase suspicion. It transformed it. People watched from a distance, measuring gestures, interpreting normalcy as performance. He moved through grocery aisles and parking lots with the awareness of being seen. His freedom conditional in the court of public opinion. Silence followed him there too, no longer protective, simply persistent. Her family retreated from view, not out of defeat, but necessity. They had spent years carrying grief in public, allowing it to be interpreted, debated, weighed. Now they chose privacy, leaving behind a void that advocacy groups and commentators tried to fill, often clumsily. Their absence became its own kind of statement. Investigators quietly reviewed alternate theories that had never gained traction. Possibilities once deemed unlikely were reconsidered, not because they had strengthened, but because the primary narrative had weakened. The phone resurfaced again in discussions, still missing, still unaccounted for, still stubbornly resistant to explanation. A retired detective revisited his old notes and noticed something that hadn't troubled him before. A narrow window in the timeline where no one could place her, not definitively. It was brief, easily overlooked, but it suggested a moment of vulnerability that did not depend on the suspect's presence. The realization unsettled him. It didn't exonerate anyone. It complicated everything. Another theory gained quiet attention, one involving chance rather than familiarity. A wrong place, a wrong moment, an encounter that escalated quickly and vanished just as fast. It was less satisfying, less narratively clean. It offered no identifiable antagonist, no arc of betrayal, but it explained the randomness of the scene, the lack of personal evidence, the way the car had been left untouched. The town resisted this idea instinctively. Randomness feels cruel. It offers no warning, no lesson. Familiarity, by contrast, gives shape to fear. It suggests that danger has a face, a name, a history. Letting go of that meant accepting that what happened could happen again without pattern or reason. Media attention shifted elsewhere, but the internet did not forget. Amateur investigators dissected transcripts, freeze-framed footage, mapped routes with obsessive precision. Forums filled with speculation, some careful, some reckless. Old witnesses were named, misnamed, accused, defended. The case fractured into countless private theories, none strong enough to unify consensus. Years passed in this suspended state. Advances in technology promised new tools, but without new evidence, tools had nothing to grip. DNA could only answer questions it was asked, and the questions remained too broad, too compromised by time. Occasionally, a tip arrived, a call from someone who remembered something late, or believed they did. Each was logged, evaluated, set aside. Hope flickered briefly with each one, then dimmed again. The rhythm became familiar, almost ritualistic. The access road aged quietly. Grass grew thicker along its edges. Tire marks came and went. New drivers passed without knowing its history, unaware that for some, this unremarkable stretch of pavement marked the boundary between before and after. On anniversaries, small gestures persisted, flowers left anonymously, notes folded and tucked into roadside signs. No ceremonies, no speeches, just acknowledgement. The case remained what it had always been beneath the headlines and court filings, a disappearance that resisted meaning, not because no one cared, but because caring alone could not reconstruct a moment that had slipped away intact. And in that resistance, the mystery endured, not dramatic, not loud, but constant, a low presence in the background of lives that continued despite it, shaped quietly by the knowledge that some questions, once asked, never truly stop asking themselves. Time did what it always does after attention fades. It rearranged priorities. It softened outrage into something quieter, more manageable. The case slipped from headlines into footnotes, mentioned only when anniversaries or unrelated crimes pulled it briefly back into focus. Yet beneath that calm, something unsettled remained, a pressure that never quite released. Within law enforcement, the file was no longer discussed openly. It surfaced instead in side conversations, in the pauses between meetings, in the careful way younger detectives were warned about drawing conclusions too early. It became an example without being named, a cautionary outline traced around a mistake no one wanted to own. One investigator, newly assigned to cold cases, reviewed the disappearance with no emotional attachment to 2005, no loyalty to the original theories. To him, the file felt uneven. Certain details were overdeveloped, others barely touched. He noticed how early assumptions had guided later interpretations, how some paths had been reinforced simply because they were familiar. He focused on the first 48 hours again, not the conclusions, just the movement. Who was where? Who wasn't? The access road reappeared, but not as a destination, as a transition, a place passed through, not chosen. That subtle shift changed how everything else lined up. He returned to witness logs and found something small, almost invisible. A report filed late, time-stamped oddly, noting a vehicle seen turning off the highway that morning, briefly, then rejoining traffic. It had been dismissed as irrelevant, lacking detail. Now it suggested interruption, not rendezvous. The investigator followed that thread carefully, aware of how easily hope could distort perception. He cross-checked traffic patterns, delivery schedules, work commutes from that time period. The picture that emerged was incomplete, but it suggested movement without connection, proximity without relationship. He brought the idea forward quietly. There was no appetite for another reopening, no tolerance for public re-examination. The case had already consumed goodwill. Still, the theory was noted, folded gently into the file like an annotation that might never be read again. Elsewhere, her family continued to live with absence in private ways. They marked milestones without ceremony, measured time not in years but in what might have been. The verdict had changed nothing for them except the vocabulary others used when speaking about her. Online, the narrative grew more distorted with each retelling. Certainty hardened where evidence had never existed. Strangers claimed insights, secrets, revelations. The truth became negotiable, shaped by whoever spoke loudest. And yet, occasionally, something real cut through the noise. A message from someone who remembered a detail they had never shared. A photo uncovered in an old box. A routine audit of digital archives that flagged a discrepancy no one had noticed before. Each moment carried possibility, fragile and brief. One such audit revealed that a nearby business camera had been assumed inactive in 2005. Records showed it had functioned intermittently that summer. The footage itself was gone, overwritten years earlier, but the realization altered assumptions again. Someone may have been seen. Someone may have passed unnoticed, not because they were invisible, but because no one knew where to look. The investigator felt the familiar frustration settle in, the sense of arriving too late to ask the right questions. It was a feeling shared by everyone who touched the case after the fact. The access road remained unchanged. No marker, no sign, just pavement and grass and the occasional slowing car. The land gave nothing back. In quiet moments, those closest to the case acknowledged what the trial had made undeniable. Even the wrong answer can feel better than no answer at all. But comfort is not truth. And comfort, once examined, often dissolves. So the case persisted in its current form, not officially open, not officially closed. A cold case not because it lacked attention, but because it resisted resolution. And in that resistance, it continued to shape lives indirectly, teaching lessons no one had asked to learn, reminding those who look too closely that silence does not always hide guilt. Sometimes, it simply marks the edge of what can still be known. Years later, the case still refused to settle into the past. It surfaced unexpectedly in training rooms, in late-night discussions between detectives who understood that experience doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes it only sharpens uncertainty. New crimes were compared to it instinctively, not because of similarity, but because of what it represented. The danger of mistaking momentum for truth. A missing persons task force reviewed unresolved cases statewide, filtering them through updated behavioral models. Her name appeared again, highlighted by algorithms that flagged patterns others had missed. Not matches, echoes, disappearances where vehicles were left intact, phones missing, no immediate violence visible. Each case alone meant little. Together, they suggested something more diffuse, harder to target. The idea unsettled those who saw it. A serial pattern without a signature. Opportunistic, adaptive, almost invisible. It was not the kind of theory that led to arrests. It was the kind that expanded fear quietly, forcing investigators to accept how little control they might actually have. They revisited regional reports from 2004 and 2006, attempted abductions that had never escalated, encounters that ended before they became crimes. One involved a woman approached on a roadside, another a driver signaling for help where none was needed. Each incident had been dismissed, isolated, absorbed by the noise of daily policing. Now they sat uncomfortably close to her disappearance, not aligned, but adjacent. The task force debated whether to pursue the connection. Resources were thin. Evidence was theoretical. Pursuing a ghost risked reopening wounds without delivering answers. Still, the pattern lingered, refusing to be ignored completely. Her case was quietly reclassified internally. Not reopened, not closed, but tagged for conditional review. A bureaucratic compromise that acknowledged doubt without committing to action. Meanwhile, the suspect faded from view. He moved away, changed routines, lived carefully. Some took that as confirmation of guilt unpunished. Others saw it as survival under a shadow that would never lift. He never spoke publicly. Silence remained his chosen language, and over time, people stopped waiting for it to break. Her family aged with the case. Grief softened at the edges, not because it diminished, but because it had been carried so long it reshaped the muscles that held it. They learned how to exist without answers, how to deflect questions without bitterness, how to remember without demanding resolution. Occasionally, a documentary producer called. A podcast host asked for an interview. Each request reopened the same calculation: visibility versus peace. Most were declined. The story had already taken enough. In law enforcement archives, the case file grew thicker, not with evidence, but with commentary. Notes added years apart reflected changing philosophies, evolving standards, shifting confidence in what constituted proof. Reading it straight through felt like tracing the history of doubt itself. One annotation, written long after the trial, stood out for its restraint. Assume nothing that cannot be placed in time and space. It was less a directive than a confession, a reminder born from hindsight. The access road continued to absorb traffic and weather. New development crept closer. Survey markers appeared. The land prepared for change without regard for memory. Some argued for a memorial. Others resisted, believing it would suggest certainty where none existed. The road remained unmarked. As technology advanced, the promise of future answers persisted just long enough to sustain attention. Improved databases, better analytics, smarter reconstructions. Each innovation reopened the same question. Was there anything left to find? The honest answer remained uncomfortable. Possibly. Probably not. And yet, cold cases are defined less by what they lack than by what they refuse to release. This one held on to ambiguity with unusual strength, surviving not because of neglect, but because every attempt to solve it exposed another layer of uncertainty beneath. The phrase cold case cracked faded from use, replaced by quieter language. Contested, unresolved, complicated, Words that acknowledge effort without promising closure. What remained was not a villain, not a solution, but a caution, a reminder that time can sharpen questions as easily as it dulls them, and that silence, whether chosen or imposed, can outlast every theory built to explain it. The case settled into a kind of institutional memory, carried forward not by urgency, but by habit. New detectives encountered it the way one encounters a scar, something earned, something cautionary, something that tells a story without repeating it. They learned which assumptions had hardened too early, which doubts had arrived too late. They learned how certainty can be manufactured when patience runs out. Every few years, a review cycle returned it briefly to the surface. Boxes opened, digital folders synced, names reread, the same questions resurfaced, framed slightly differently, softened by experience. What had been missed? What had been misread? What had been accepted because the alternative was unbearable? One review focused on geography again, not as evidence, but as context. The access road was measured against human behavior rather than criminal intent. Why people stop, why they slow, why they pull over when nothing appears wrong. Fatigue, courtesy, habit. The mundane reasons were often overlooked because they lacked drama. Yet they explained how someone could vanish without resistance, without noise, without witnesses. Another review reconsidered time. Not the hour she disappeared, but the weeks before. Subtle shifts in routine. Small deviations that never rose to the level of alarm. The possibility that the critical moment wasn't sudden at all, but cumulative, built from choices that felt insignificant when made. The phone returned to the center again, not as a device, but as a decision. Taking it required awareness. Leaving everything else suggested focus. That choice implied purpose, without revealing identity. It was the kind of detail that teased intention while withholding its owner. Outside official channels, the case found a quieter audience, students, analysts, researchers who studied failure as carefully as success. They mapped it as a lesson in investigative gravity, how early momentum pulls later reasoning into its orbit. The case became an example cited without names, anonymized but recognizable, a story about process rather than outcome. Her name remained known locally, spoken with care, rarely followed by speculation anymore. Time had stripped the edges off rumor, leaving behind something closer to respect. People remembered who she was, not just how she vanished. That shift felt important, even if it didn't bring answers. The suspect's life continued elsewhere. Unremarkable by design, distance became his shield. Years passed without incident, without confession, without revelation. Those who watched for signs eventually stopped looking. Silence, once provocative, became ordinary. Occasionally, someone claimed to know what really happened. A letter, an email, a late-night call. Each claim collapsed under scrutiny, dissolving into attention-seeking or misremembered coincidence. The case learned to reject noise efficiently. The access road was widened eventually, resurfaced, made safer. Construction crews worked without ceremony, unaware of what they were altering. Layers of asphalt sealed layers of memory. The physical trace grew thinner, replaced by infrastructure that prioritized movement over reflection. And yet, even as the environment changed, the case retained its shape. It remained unresolved not because of neglect, but because every plausible explanation demanded a certainty that no longer existed. Evidence had aged, memories had shifted, motives had blurred. What remained was a question with too many acceptable answers and no decisive way to choose among them. In quiet acknowledgments, investigators admitted what once felt unthinkable, that the truth might be fragmented beyond repair, not hidden, not erased, but scattered so widely that reassembly was no longer possible. That admission didn't end the search. It redefined it. The goal shifted from resolution to understanding limits, from finding an answer to recognizing why one could not be found. Cold cases, at their core, are not frozen moments. They are slow-moving realities, changing shape as people and systems change around them. This one had outlasted certainty, outlasted accusation, outlasted even the promise of closure. What it left behind was quieter and heavier, a shared recognition that some silences endure not because no one listens, but because there's nothing left that can speak with authority. In the end, the case did not conclude with revelation or reckoning. It concluded the way many cold cases do, not with an answer, but with endurance. The endurance of questions that refused to dissolve, of memories that adapted rather than faded, of a community that learned to live beside an absence without pretending it had been filled. The access road, now widened and resurfaced, carried traffic more efficiently than ever. Cars passed at speed. Drivers unaware that this ordinary stretch of pavement once marked the precise moment when certainty broke. Nothing in the landscape indicated loss. No sign instructed anyone to slow down and remember. And yet, for those who knew, the road remained heavy with implication, a reminder that places do not forget even when people must. Her name existed now in quieter spaces, in family conversations, in personal rituals that required no witnesses. She was remembered less for how she disappeared, and more for who she had been before the story claimed her. That, in itself, felt like a small reclamation. Within law enforcement, the file remained accessible, its status unchanged. Not closed, not active, a permanent question mark embedded in a system built to produce conclusions. New technologies would come, new methods, new promises of clarity. Whether they would ever find something meaningful here was uncertain. Experience suggested otherwise. The suspect never returned to the public narrative. Time carried him forward, indifferent to suspicion, unmoved by doubt. If he held a truth, it stayed with him. If he did not, the silence surrounding him became a mirror for the case itself, reflecting whatever people needed it to reflect. What remained undeniable was the cost of waiting. Years spent searching for patterns that dissolved under examination. Energy devoted to answers that never solidified. Lives shaped by a single unanswered morning. The trial, the acquittal, the headlines. All of it faded into context, secondary to the fact that she never came home. Cold cases are often described as unfinished stories. This one resisted even that framing. It was finished in form, documented, archived, analyzed. What it lacked was not effort, but permission. To know, to confirm, to conclude without compromise. In the absence of certainty, people learn to hold complexity, to accept that justice can be pursued sincerely and still fall short, that silence does not always conceal guilt, that some truths do not survive the passage of time intact enough to be proven. The case became a quiet reference point, invoked not for its drama, but for its restraint, a reminder whispered rather than announced. It taught that resolution is not guaranteed, that the language of closure can be misleading, that patience does not always pay dividends in clarity. And yet, the case endured because it mattered, not as a cautionary tale, not as a failure, but as a human story that refused simplification. It asked listeners, investigators, and communities to sit with uncertainty without trying to conquer it. The final silence was not empty. It was full of what had been lost, what had been tried, what could never be recovered. It lingered not as a challenge to be solved, but as a presence to be acknowledged. Because some mysteries do not demand answers. They demand remembrance. The story did not end where the file stopped. It continued in the way unresolved things always do. Quietly, indirectly, embedded in decisions that no longer carried her name. Detectives who never worked the case still felt its influence, choosing patience over speed, doubt over momentum, because somewhere in their training sat an example that had taught them what certainty can cost. In classrooms and briefings, the disappearance was referenced obliquely, not as a failure, not as a success, but as a boundary, a line beyond which confidence must slow. Instructors spoke about early assumptions, about how narratives form before facts harden, about how easily a case can begin to solve itself before the truth has a chance to catch up. No one said her name out loud. It wasn't necessary. The town changed hands. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. Streets were renamed. Businesses closed and reopened under different signs. The past thinned, diluted by ordinary progress. Yet sometimes, when a local went missing even briefly, a teenager late coming home, a driver overdue from a trip, the reaction was immediate, sharp, shaped by memory rather than logic. The echo remained. Her family carried on with a discipline that looked like acceptance to outsiders. They spoke less often about answers and more about continuity. Birthdays were acknowledged. Traditions preserved. The missing space was never filled, but it was integrated, made survivable. They learned that moving forward did not require agreement with the past. Online interest flickered now and then, reignited by anniversaries or algorithmic coincidence. Each resurgence followed the same arc: intense curiosity, recycled theories, confident conclusions, eventual exhaustion. The case absorbed it all without changing. Some nights, former investigators admitted they still thought about the access road, about how ordinary it was, how little it offered as explanation. They wondered whether the case's resistance was its message, that not every disappearance conforms to motive, that not every absence conceals a villain who can be named. The absence itself had become the truth. Years later, a clerk auditing archive materials noticed the file again. Flagged not for action, but for preservation. The paper was aging. The digital copies needed redundancy. The case was stabilized, protected against loss, even if it could not be advanced. That quiet act felt appropriate. If nothing else, the record would endure. And so the case remained, intact but incomplete. A cold case not defined by neglect or indifference, but by limits reached honestly. It stood as proof that effort does not guarantee outcome, that justice can be sought without being secured, that silence can persist even under relentless attention. There was no final revelation waiting offstage, no confession aging toward inevitability, no forgotten witness preparing to speak. The story had given everything it could. What remained was responsibility, the responsibility to remember without distorting, to question without forcing answers, to accept that some mysteries are not puzzles but conditions. In that acceptance, the case found its last shape, not solved, not forgotten, simply held, carefully, by those who understood that the truest ending was not certainty, but respect for what could never be fully known.